After decades of a waxing and waning quasi-Cold War, the United States and its loyal eunuch Israel launched full-scale attacks on Iran. On the 28th of February 2026, brutal strikes on Tehran marked the beginning of yet another regime change war fueled by oil and well.
Yes, 1 minute. 1 minute.
It's definitely going on. You might be thinking that claims of weapons of mass destruction as a basis to start a regime change war sounds familiar, and to that I say, trust me, it's for realsies this time. It's a war that quite literally only Israel wanted, and as people continue to accept their fell for it again award from the peace-loving administration, real consequences of their war are already becoming quickly apparent. It may seem like this war came from left field after Iran's nuclear facilities were apparently destroyed last year, but as the great dialectical saying goes, you exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. And this war certainly didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. So, how did we get here? Without turning this into an intro lecture to an Iranian history class, and trust me, I'd love to do that, the modern state of Iran as we know it emerged in the early 20th century out of a declining Qajar dynasty which ruled over what was historically called Persia. The Qajar dynasty heavily decentralized government rule, and by the final years of the dynasty, the government was known as inefficient and weak. The British had already taken an interest in the oil-rich Iran and took advantage of an inefficient Qajar dynasty to assert their interests, which only further infuriated Iranians already pissed about foreign influences in the country. The Constitutional Revolution in 1906 established an electoral system in the Majlis, basically a parliament and senate, and planted the seed for the rise of Reza Khan, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. The aborted Anglo-Persian agreement in 1919 was a last-ditch effort by the Qajar Shah Ahmad to retain control of Iran. Coming off of World War I, Iran had territories occupied by the Soviets and the British and found themselves in the same economic depression the rest of the world was also facing to varying degrees. The agreement outlined a plan by the Shah to hand over control of the military and economy to the British, so basically the entire power structure of the country, but outcry over the agreement domestically, as well as the British rejecting the offer, was a huge embarrassment for the Qajar dynasty. All this to say, by the 1921 coup led by Reza Khan, the Qajar dynasty's power was basically non-existent. He marched into Tehran with his Persian Cossack brigade and was met with little resistance as his forces took over key government facilities. Saeed Zayedin Tabatabai, a politician that helped with the coup as well, was declared prime minister, and with Reza Khan, the new government had a de facto control over Iran. Shah Ahmad made futile attempts to regain control, ending up in exile by 1923, though the official end to the Qajar dynasty did not come until 1925, when Reza Khan, now Reza Pahlavi, filled the monarch-sized hole in Iran's heart. I want to mention here that the matter of the British assisting Pahlavi in the coup of 1921 is historically debated as far as the extent of their involvement, but it's worth mentioning that British General Edmund Ironside handpicked Reza Khan. Regardless, there was a new government in town, and Reza Pahlavi was the start of an almost dynasty. When the Russian Civil War began in 1917 following the October Revolution, the British used Iran to invade Russia to assist on the side of the whites in opposition to the Bolsheviks. When Reza Khan became Shah, he sought to avoid the pulls of foreign influence and power. He quickly developed a nationalistic style of governing, setting out to centralize rule, he was a dictator, and modernize, westernize, the country. The effectiveness of his policies are still debated, but his most controversial economic decision came in the Anglo-Persian oil company's, now BP, concessions in 1933. Iran and BP were scrapping over the huge oil concessions given to the company originally in 1901. Oil concessions valid for 60 years with exclusive rights to oil exploration in the entire country apart from 5 provinces. Iranians wanted the rights to their oil back, and even more obviously, the British wanted to keep their steel, so a long, drawn-out legal battle ensued until concessions were reached in 1933, not without controversies that would set the scene for future events. The main concessions made it so that the land owned by BP would decrease from 480,000 square miles to 100,000 square miles, and extended their stay in Iran by 32 years, so by the end of 1993 the concessions would end. This doesn't mean relations between Iran and Britain improved, however.
Iran has had a complicated relationship with the West for a long time. Not even its announced neutrality during World War II was enough to stop the British and Soviet forces from landing on the country in 1941 to secure its oil reserves and make sure the Allied supply routes were not interfered with. Iran's wishes for independence were irrelevant when air power took out its communication and airfields. and mechanized units overran its cities. After foreign troops left the country in 1946, the Persian state attempted to return to normality, riding a wave of reform and nationalism. Iran's political system saw the rise of the National Front coalition and Mohammad Mossadegh to the office of prime minister. In response to public strife and economic need, Mossadegh and the parliament, the Majlis, voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and make it the National Iranian Oil Company in 1951. Ultimately, Iran wanted to gain control of its natural resource, achieve energy security, and sell its oil and use the profits to help with the economic issues. Unsurprisingly, Britain did not take well to the Majlis move and quickly moved to start a large-scale economic terrorism campaign like the one Iran faces today.
You may be thinking to yourself, oh no, they're gonna get couped by the United States. And to that I say you're wrong. They were couped by the US at the behest of the UK. Prime Minister Mossadegh first suggested an audit of BP, which the Brits refused for reasons unknown, I'm sure, to all of us. BP also never complied with its commitment under the 1933 agreement with Reza Shah to give laborers better pay, build schools, hospitals, roads, or telephone systems, so Mossadegh proceeded with the nationalization of the oil industry as a result. The British began plotting to overthrow Mossadegh immediately. By September 1951, the UK had imposed an oil embargo on Iran and by 1952 broke diplomatic relations. Additionally, Britain lobbied its allies to not buy Iranian oil, froze assets in British banks even after its case in international courts didn't pan out, and even blockaded Iranian refineries to prevent tankers from loading oil. Mossadegh learned about one of the schemes in October 1952, and he closed the British embassy. This meant all British diplomats, including agents working under diplomatic cover, had to leave Iran and left no one to carry out that specific attempt. The British approached the Truman administration for help in ousting Mossadegh, but Truman's apparent sympathies with nationalist movements stopped him from providing any assistance. He tried to diplomatically prevent the nationalization, which didn't convince Mossadegh. However, with the Eisenhower administration taking over, the president's staunch anti-communist attitude led them to agreeing to help the British stage a coup with the CIA, especially after the British convinced them Iran would become a Soviet satellite. Operation Ajax was set in motion first to convince the at-the-time young Shah to dismiss Mossadegh of his position as prime minister. Muhammad Shah was known to be indecisive and mousy by others, with the British diplomat stating, quote, "He has no moral courage and succumbs easily to fear," end quote. In the early hours of the actual coup attempt on August 16, 1953, Operation Ajax was not going to plan. The Shah had given the firman or order to remove Mossadegh and replace him with General Fazlollah Zahedi, a royalist, but somewhere along the way the plot was discovered, and when Colonel Nementullah Nasiri came to deliver the firman to Mossadegh and arrest the prime minister, he was instead arrested. The Shah and his family fled first to Iraq, and the news of this was immediately spread to the Iranians. MI6 and the CIA did not give in, however, and continued to stage anti-Mossadegh efforts. Mass demonstrations began on August 19, 1953, spurred by MI6 and CIA efforts. Pro-Shah demonstrators joined the fray with intelligence agency plans in various politically aligned groups and later religious groups. Bloody clashes broke out between the Tudeh communists, nationalists, and royalists, and Mossadegh was pointedly slow to crack down on street demonstrations at first, only making a late attempt that was heavily influenced by American pressure that amounted to complete American withdrawal from Iran, something Mossadegh wasn't hoping for. He then banned demonstrations the next day, which effectively signed the closure of his movement, even calling organizers to keep their people home. Pro-Shah groups demonstrated despite the ban, and there were no attempts to stop the march to the city center. Mossadegh was arrested after a tank shelled his home, and he was placed on house arrest for the rest of his life. All it seemed to be going back to plan as far as Iran goes, with a new prime minister, the Shah returning, and most importantly, the oil staying open to non-Iranians. Though the 1953 coup kept the Shah in power and the oil private, this wouldn't last forever.
Iranian oil may again flow westward.
So, Operation Ajax was a success. How will Iran be with Mossadegh gone and the evil of oil nationalization defeated? BP attempted to get back into the groove of things as far as their Iranian oil went, but obviously the population did not immediately forget that the company was one of, if not their biggest problem. So an international consortium was called to organize updated concessions. BP held 40% of the shares, 5 American companies together held another 40%, and the rest were distributed to Royal Dutch/Shell and a French company I won't bother pronouncing because French isn't a real language, but I know that the current name of it is Total Energies. The non-British companies paid BP $1 billion for their 60% of the concession. The consortium was completely foreignly organized, though they kept the name Mossadegh intended, the National Iranian Oil Company. It would share the profits on a 50-50 basis with Iran, but for reasons I'm sure no one can decipher even now, auditors and board members could not be Iranian. With his place on the throne secure again, for now, the Shah knew threats to his reign were not over, especially with nicknames like the Baghdad Fugitive. He consolidated his authority greatly over the next decade, crushing political dissent brutally with the Security and Intelligence Organization, or SAVAK. He used SAVAK to wipe the last of the Tudeh cells and the other dissidents over the next years of royal rule. He did attempt to modernize Iran, namely with the White Revolution in 1963, which introduced things such as land reforms, better infrastructure, and greater visibility for women in public life. This White Revolution planted the seeds of his fall, as more conservative Iranians disagreed with the land reforms and especially women's rights. He purchased mass amounts of arms from the United States with about $10 billion USD spent between 1972 and 1976, which he was able to do because of the 1973 oil crisis that made Iranian oil a life source during the Arab embargo. Despite this, the budget deficit in regard to their foreign exchange reserves almost sent Iran into bankruptcy. Since the global recession of the 1960s, Iran was hit hard due to their increasing dependence on oil exports and foreign imports for almost everything else. He writes, quote, "Yet it is fair to say that in later years, the state industrialization program became overambitious and out of control, leading to waste, corruption, and nepotism. At times it was devoid of any meaningful relation to the state's preconceived master plan. The growth of the industrial sector barely satisfied the domestic market's growing demand for goods and services. Imports of all sorts from Europe, the United States, and Japan flooded Iran's markets, mostly at the expense of the bazaar sector and associated small-scale manufacturers and wholesalers." End quote. Finally, later in the 70s, labor strikes disrupted the Shah's rule as the years of revolution crawled closer with every paralyzed industry. The secular nationalist movements were not the last of the Pahlavi dynasty's problems, but the Islamic Revolution certainly turned out to be. Though the government power remained with the Shah and the parliament, the Shiite clergy still held massive influence over Iran. One particular clergy member, Ruhollah Khomeini, gained traction throughout the late 50s and especially in the early 60s when the White Revolution was happening in Iran. When the 1953 coup against Mossadegh happened, Khomeini, along with most of the middle and upper ranks of the clergy, were on the side of the Shah for the fear that Tudeh communists would take over in the chaos. However, as the White Revolution introduced land reforms and greater visibility of women in public life, the conservative clergy's relationship with the Shah began to sour, especially Khomeini, who took up cause against the Shah as a whole. By then, Khomeini gathered a sizable support base primarily with the bazaar and urban lower middle classes. His main concern was his view that a secular Iran was an Iran of fading moral standards. He was arrested and exiled in 1964 after riots broke out in support of him, which only continued to grow his support base in Iran among Shiite Muslims as a whole. He stayed in Turkey, then Iraq, and finally Paris. Discontent continued to grow in Iran over the Shah's rule, and by the late 70s, the country was in near constant turmoil. President Jimmy Carter, an ally of the Shah, was apparently a staunch supporter of human rights and freedom of speech. This in turn spurred open letters from Iranian groups and officials criticizing the Shah government's own human rights abuses as well as other mishandlings of the country. Corruption and mismanagement, especially in public works under the Shah, had been a long-standing issue for the Iranians as well as the Shah's human rights abuses. Carter's advocacy did not wake up what was already felt. The Jalal massacre on September 8, 1978, where Imperial Iranian soldiers shot into a crowd of civilians protesting against the Shah, was another spark in an already smoldering Pahlavi Iran. With journalists writing, the scenes were that of a firing squad. In late December 1978, having gotten nowhere with religious leaders, the Shah began to negotiate in secret with Shapur Bakhtiar, another National Front member and leader of the newly revived Iran Party, also involved in revolution sentiment at the time. He did this to offer him the position of prime minister. He took the offer despite his own party being against it and was promptly expelled from the National Front. Quote, "Unfortunately for Bakhtiar, the tone of the protest movement had taken a decidedly more radical and more Islamic turn. Calls for the downfall of the Pahlavi dictatorship were no longer followed by demands to restore the 1906 constitution, but to end the despotic institution of monarchy and return to the Islamic justice, and soon after to establish an Islamic government, and eventually an Islamic republic." The US supported the Bakhtiar government as it attempted to establish itself, while Khomeini condemned it. On January 19, 1979, the Shah left for Egypt on a vacation, though he knew the writing was on the walls, judging by him literally leaving and crying as he boarded his plane in Iran for the last time. When Khomeini finally returned to Tehran, he was welcomed by thousands of waiting supporters. In his first sermon, he declared the Bakhtiar government, the Majlis, and the Senate illegitimate. In late October 1979, the Shah had arrived in New York to receive treatment for his cancer. He approached his besties, including Henry Kissinger and Nelson Rockefeller, for an entry visa to the United States, and his arrival in New York grew further suspicions of U.S. involvement in the 1953 coup. On November 1979, a group of young hardliners named the Students of the Imam Line took over the American embassy in Tehran. They took 66 U.S. diplomats and staff hostage, demanding the Shah's return to stand trial in a revolutionary court. While demanding for the Shah's return, the students alleged that the U.S. Embassy was a spy den, conspiring against the revolution and aiming to stage a coup to restore the Shah. It should be noted here, a lot of these hostages were literal CIA assets, and the students knew this after they got to the Americans in the first place because they were too busy shredding documents to flee. The students poured over hundreds of secret files, and intelligence details they found certainly did not help the fact that many Iranians suspected the 1953 coup was U.S.-led anyway. Later, on April 24, 1980, Operation Eagle Claw was enacted by the U.S. Army Delta Force in collaboration with other units of the U.S. Armed Forces, and they attempted to rescue the hostages. The orders were as follows. Quote, U.S. troops were to land on a deserted airstrip in the middle of the central Iranian desert. Then fly some 400 miles north with helicopters to secure base near the capital. Then storm the embassy compound and after releasing the hostages, drive them over to an airstrip near the capital and fly them back to safety abroad. As we know, it was a total failure of an operation that was aborted due to a sandstorm while the troops were landing in the Lut Desert. 3 helicopters crashed into a C-130 in the chaos of trying to haul ass away and killed 8 personnel. In total, the hostages were held for 444 days, only being released following Reagan's inauguration as president, but, hilariously, Carter was trying to negotiate the return of the hostages up until that point too. The Iran-Iraq War was infamous for many reasons and a clusterfuck of policy on the part of the United States. Diplomatic relations with Iraq were officially re-established during the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration would also provide weapons to Iraq, along with other economic aid. Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980 was spurred on by border disputes and Iran's backing of Kurdish rebels, which were previously settled by the Algiers Agreement only 5 years prior. Basically, Iraq and the US had a common enemy in Iran. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, but unironically, aka very shaky relations. Mind you, the Iran-Contra affair was also happening during this time, so the US was also secretly providing Iran with weapons so Americans can fund right-wing death squads in Central and South America. Yet another can of worms that can be discussed for hours. Like I said, a clusterfuck of policy. Chemical attacks were most infamously employed during this war, and U.S. intelligence knew that chemical warfare was a possibility as early as July 1982, where they literally identified both sides preparing for it through administration of equipment like gas masks. Both the Reagan administration and Margaret Thatcher's conservative government directly or through third party facilitated the sale of material for chemical weapons to Iraq. The worst example of chemical warfare happened in Halabja, a Kurdish village in Iraq but near the Iranian border. Iran reported to the UN on March 18, 1988, that Iraqi forces deployed mustard gas and nerve agents on the town, which had been claimed by Iranian forces 2 days before. In an unclassified CIA document from March 24, 1988, this fact is acknowledged, but the document also states Iranians deployed their own. The Reagan administration at the time first seemed to completely ignore Halabja, only making a lukewarm statement condemning the use of chemical weapons from both sides. Even still, Halabja was never mentioned by name. The Bush administration would take up this mantle, though, in 2003, honoring the victims in Halabja by using their tragic deaths as justification for invading Iraq and killing hundreds of thousands of people in the ensuing nearly decade-long war and occupation. But we're jumping ahead now. The war between Iran and Iraq became a stalemate over time, dragging on longer because Saddam couldn't end the war despite US backing. By September 1981, the Iranians forced the Iraqis to lift the siege on Abadan, and by December, the Iranian army units had pushed back the Iraqi army along the western and northwestern fronts. June 1982 marked the end of the first phase of the war in Iran's favor. Despite political and strategic advantages, however, Iran refused the ceasefire offered by a number of mediators from Hussein's camp. With this, Iran took a new offensive approach for the war's second phase. By the end of 1983, an estimated 120,000 Iranians and 60,000 Iraqis had been killed in war. The United States had played a pivotal role in the Tanker War of 1984 to 1988, aimed to escort Kuwaiti, Saudi, and Iraqi vessels and protect them against Iranian attacks in the Persian Gulf. By April 1988, U.S. support for Saddam had effectively turned the tides of the war in favor of the Iraqis. By early 1988, an estimated 300,000 died on the Iranian side and 250,000 on the Iraqi side. Still, the war dragged on. Iran realized that it could no longer sustain high casualties and the huge economic costs of the war without the risk of new eternal dissent and conflict, especially with their international isolation. On July 3, 1988, the U.S. Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, downed an Iran Air passenger Airbus, resulting in the loss of 290 civilian lives, and it horrified internationally. The tragedy reportedly was caused by the U.S. cruiser mistaking the passenger airliner as an approaching Iranian fighter jet, an extremely void of logic judgment given Iran's poor Air Force capabilities at the time and the U.S. Vincennes' advanced radar and intelligence equipment. On July 20th, Iran accepted the UN Security Council Resolution 598. The United States barely expressed regret for the tragedy, blaming it on the roguery of the Iran Air pilot. 8 years later, when the United States agreed to pay only minimal reparations to the victims' relatives, Iranians understandably recognized this blatant disrespect as further attempts to humiliate them. By August 20th, 1988, although both countries observed a ceasefire on all fronts, Iraq refused to evacuate from the frontier territories it had captured in the last years of the war, in violation of the resolution. In reality, Iraq didn't abide by any of the additional terms of the resolution. The combination of their international isolation and sharp decline to the Iran-Iraq war due to U.S. meddling led them to accept the UN ceasefire in 1988 despite no explicit recognition of Iraq's belligerence. Despite funding Iraq directly during the Iran-Iraq War, the Reagan administration was exposed on November 3, 1986 by Lebanese magazine Ash-Shira for secretly selling weapons to Iran.
That initiative was undertaken for the simplest and best of reasons: to renew a relationship with the nation of Iran, to bring an honorable end to the bloody 6-year war between Iran and Iraq, to eliminate state-sponsored terrorism and subversion, and to effect the safe return of all hostages.
Now, while I'd honestly be fine with inserting the American Dad song here to explain the entire affair,
in the 80s there was Cold War drama.
I think my fellow comrade might kill me for it.
Freedom was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines.
Anyways, never mind Reagan's assurance of not selling weapons to terrorists, he wanted those damn commies in Nicaragua gone. Never mind also that he and Congress just passed the Boland Amendments prohibiting the very funding of the Contras
just cause they moved a teeny bit of blow.
During the deals, an Israeli-linked dealer from Iran, Ghorbanifad, acted as an intermediary, claiming to have connections to moderates in the Iranian government. And yes, the Iranian government was desperate enough in war times to collaborate with both the Great Satan and the Zionist state. Ghorbanifad was also an ex-SAVAK agent, which should tell you a lot right away. The Americans, on the other hand, had Lieutenant Colonel
North.
But make no mistake, the top administration members like National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and later Admiral John Poindexter, as well as Reagan, were all in on it. More than 2,500 American-made TLW anti-tank missiles were sold to Iran over 2 years. Israelis reportedly went as far as to scratch the tracing numbers and Hebrew letters from the missiles and parts they sold to Iran as well. This may come as a shock, but the CIA was also involved in the process of handing over the money to the Contras, as they were already moving weapons taken from the PLO to the Contras as well, of course with the help of Israel. Operation Tipped Kettle is yet another can of worms. Sorry for the amount of those here, but the video would be 8 hours long otherwise. The affair itself was publicized after Mehdi Hashemi, a senior official in the IRGC, approached Ash-Shira magazine with the information. The ensuing media frenzy in the United States resulted in the televised congressional hearings for North and others involved. They explained the weapons deals were actually intended to free the American hostages taken by Hezbollah during the Lebanese Civil War. Despite the fact that Reagan appeared on national television shortly after the affair broke internationally and claimed that while the weapon transfers had indeed occurred, the U.S. did not trade arms for hostages.
In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
Reagan issued another televised statement on March 4th, 1987, apologizing and taking responsibility for the ordeal despite it happening, quote, without his knowledge.
First, let me say I take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. As the Tower Board reported, what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages.
Not yet satisfied with everything done to Iran to this point, the last few decades have seen a new era of economic terrorism against the country. In 1995, President Bill Clinton signed executive orders to codify economic embargo on the country. Now it was the US preventing investment and denying foreign currency into Iran. This new embargo banned oil imports from Iran, deprived it from importing machinery, industrial equipment, prohibited American financial institutions from dealing with Iran, and just in case that wasn't enough, in 1996, the Iran-related Sanctions Act expanded these restrictions globally. The act threatened international companies that did business with Iran with trade penalties, including the denial of American banks and markets.
A press conference was held August 14, 2002 in Washington, D.C. by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an Iranian opposition group in exile. Alireza Jafarzadeh, the spokesperson for the group, claimed that the Iranian government had a secret nuclear program and was building 2 facilities in Iraq and Natanz, further claiming that in reality there were many more top-secret nuclear projects that the International Atomic Energy Agency didn't know about. Later, in December 2002, the U.S. released satellite imaging showing the facilities, claiming Iran was on the path to building nuclear weapons. Iran agreed to the IAEA inspections, but President Mohammad Khatami refuted the accusations that they were building weapons. Khatami later revealed that Iran had unearthed uranium deposits and announced plans to develop a nuclear fuel cycle in February 2003. IAEA Chief Mohammad El-Baradei traveled to Iran with a team of inspectors to begin probing Tehran's nuclear plans the same month, concluding Iran needed to be subjected to more invasive inspections, which Iran agreed to as well. Enriched uranium was found, but by October 2003 they agreed to halt their weapons program.
In response to the discovery of Iran's nuclear program, the UN Security Council decided to put even more restrictions on the country. The Security Council put acid freezes and personalized sanctions on organizations and institutions linked to Iran's nuclear program, like its National Research Institute and Fedrun Davani. These sanctions tried to choke out the nuclear program early by tying up any exchange of technology or technical assistance. Later resolutions also expanded the list of individuals and organizations allegedly involved with the nuclear program, adding even more fresh banking restrictions, travel bans, logistics pressure to the country on top of all the previous sanctions. To be clear, this is a very early version of the nuclear program. There are American intelligence reports that any Iranian nuclear weapons program ended in 2003 and was not restarted. The International Atomic Energy Agency, later tasked with monitoring Iran's nuclear program, never found any evidence of nuclear weapons being built or improper handling of their materials, even though, as we will see shortly, they had an incredible amount of access to the country. Understand, all of this was done on a theoretical potential risk in the future that Iran might build nuclear weapons. Iran has always been willing to negotiate and provide security assurances. There have been multiple attempts early in the decade. For example, in May 17, 2010, the Tehran Declaration was brokered by Turkey and Brazil. Here, Iran agreed in principle to ship 12,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium to Turkey in exchange for fuel for the Tehran research reactor. Iran also said it would notify the IAEA in writing within 7 days. There was no communication in response. The West has always kept the same negative and uncharitable attitude towards Iran. Finally, formal talks between Iran and the West resumed in Istanbul in April 14, 2012, after roughly a 15-month hiatus. Later meetings in Baghdad and Moscow in 2012 didn't end in much progress. Finally, in 2013, negotiations in Almaty, Kazakhstan happened, and Catherine Ashton said afterwards that the six powers had put forward a proposal in a confidence-building step-by-step process. They met again in Almaty in April 2013. No deal was reached. All this to say, even before the public breakthrough year, there had already been active negotiation attempts with a willingness from Iran to come to the table. Later, after the election of Hassan Rouhani in June 2013, a new secret bilateral US-Iran back channel in Oman was created. US and Iranian officials allegedly had secret meetings in Oman using these intelligence assets, and later Obama described these talks as the opening phase that led to the interim deal. In September 27, 2013, Obama and Rouhani had a direct phone call, the first direct communication between leaders of the two countries since relations were broken in 1979. The White House said that the two discussed efforts to reach an agreement over Iran's nuclear program. Finally, after all this politicking by Iran, reaching out to the same nations that had directly sanctioned them or looked the other way for so long, on November 24, 2013, Iran and the Six Powers agreed to the Joint Plan of Action in Geneva. The JPOA enforced a hard cap on the nuclear program, with the West offering limited temporary sanctions relief and committed not to impose new nuclear-related sanctions during the first phase. The Obama White House claimed the relief was about $7 billion, but noted that the vast majority of roughly $100 billion in Iranian foreign exchange holdings remained restricted or inaccessible. Sick. One of the things often cited as justification for skepticism against Iran is its relationship with the Axis of Resistance, a label used to refer to several groups with political, religious, and armed interests in opposition to American, Israeli, and Western interests in the Middle East. The problem here is that for whatever level of parallel resistance and actual collaboration Iran and these groups ever might have, the label and narrative implies some sort of centralized network of action out of Tehran that is simply just not there. Hezbollah is almost as old as the Islamic Republic, with its roots in the Lebanese Civil War and primarily occupied with Israeli invasions and operations into South Lebanon. So as to say, they have been a long-standing political organization with a paramilitary wing engaged in their own conflicts. Hamas emerged in the late 80s during the first Intifada, and with links to the Muslim Brotherhood, existed with absolutely no connection to Iran for the vast majority of its existence. The Houthis, or Ansar Allah, come out of the Yemeni civil war and also for a long time were preoccupied with their own conflicts before they even became the political organization they are today with the links to the IRGC. The PMF is a coalition of militia groups formed in Iraq in response to the rise of ISIS. PMF is a blanket term used to describe various militia groups with different interests and operations, not some centralized militia funded by Iraq or Iran. Again, these points are not to excuse or explain away any of these groups, the IRGC, or anything they might have or might not have done. They are extremely complex and key sort of movements that would take much more than a small section within a small video to properly address. But presenting them as Iran's attack dogs ready to be unleashed at any moment Tehran wants is fucking ridiculous. There's no evidence of a single operational hierarchy or multi-organization command anywhere. Most, if not all, parallel operations start separately and for different motives. Even Western institutions will struggle to get the story straight. They would run reports on Iran's unique relationship with whatever resistance group is currently in the news cycle, comparing them to one another and then switching their dynamic when it helps their case. Whatever your view might be on any of these groups or on Iran, there's nothing to gain from not understanding why they exist.
Today, I released a report confirming that Iran has completed the necessary preparatory steps to start the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The report was submitted to the IAEA Board of Governors and to the United Nations Security Council.
So what was in the monitoring agreement Iran agreed to? It had to be really simple and small for so many in America to continue claiming Iran was still a threat and trying to build a nuclear weapon. Well, here's what was in the agreement. Iran must immediately stop enriching uranium above 5%, neutralize a stockpile of near 20% enriched uranium, halt expansion of enrichment capacity, stop work at key facilities like Arak. Iran must also agree to daily IAEA access to Natanz and Fordo, regular inspection of centrifuge production facilities, monitoring of uranium mines and mills, access to supply chains and nuclear-related works, and detailed reporting requirements on nuclear materials. This then evolved into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, during the last meeting in Vienna, July 2015. For the sake of not perpetuating the mainstream Western narrative, it is important to stress that this wasn't some reconciliation or seizing off facilities treaty. The JCPOA was an extensive and technical framework with specific material handling, guidance, and monitoring protocols. It was a behemoth agreement aimed at ensuring Iran would be incapable of even thinking about a nuclear weapon. All of this in exchange for some extra sanctions relief, yes, but definitely not some normalization of relations. We previously mentioned some of the limitations Iran had under the original JPA, but in this new JCPOA, the scope was brought in again to include more material-specific instructions and monitoring protocols. These included enrichment capped at 3.67% of U-235, well below weapons grade 90%, total enriched uranium stockpile limited to 300 kilograms excess enriched uranium required to be diluted or exported. Centrifuges were only available at a limited amount and older and less potent models with extra monitoring into the assembly and parts. No enrichment allowed at Fordo. Reconstruction of the Arak heavy water reactor was to restructure it to prevent weapons-grade uranium plant production. All of this verifiable by the new monitoring programs the IAEA gained, which included but were not limited to access to uranium mines and mills for 25 years, centrifuge production facilities for 20 years, yellow cake production and storage, supply chain and procurement channels, daily access to Natanz and Fordo, real time, constant, 24/7, constant monitoring by cameras, electronic seal and sensors with provisions for access to undeclared sites if concern arise, environmental sampling and short notice inspections. All of this was verified from January 16, 2016 to the day the protocols and the IAEA had formally verified. What the fuck? From January 16, 2016, the day the protocols and the IAEA had formally verified had taken all necessary steps until May 8, 2019, which is when the US withdrew from the agreement. The IAEA would monitor, inspect, and report on Iran's nuclear program as planned and agreed to. So it becomes a little difficult to understand why for so long Western figures like Trump himself or John Bolton, who was very public with his aversion to the agreement, called it a gift to Iran or presented it as a one-sided agreement in favor of the Middle Eastern state when there were so many checks in place. The language Trump himself uses of planes dropping billions into Iran is also incredibly fucking rich, considering any money that flowed into Iran after the Treasury Department started the process of sanctions relief was from previously frozen uranium funds and economic agreements depending on the monitoring agreement. The JCPOA was so fucking good and valued across the international community that even when Trump shit on his hands and clapped, European powers tried to create alternative methods to trade with Iran to incentivize them to continue to uphold the standards and let the monitoring continue, which they ultimately did until the last May 8th report, with political capital on both sides running out to continue with the protocol. In 2012, a 15-year-old Iranian boy suffering from hemophilia died after his family was unable to obtain the blood clot medication required. The shortage was linked not to a direct ban on medicine, but to banking and trade restrictions that made importing the drug effectively impossible at the time. Iranian health officials warned that supply of hemophilia medication had fallen to roughly one-third of previous levels, leaving thousands of patients at risk. Shortages forced doctors to use inferior or improved treatments. A report documented a woman who suffered serious complications after a cesarean section due to the use of non-standard anesthesia, which had to be substituted because higher quality medication was unavailable under sanctioned conditions. Patients with conditions that cause extreme skin fragility and pain comparable to severe burns lost access to specialized bandages after foreign suppliers halted shipments due to sanctions-related risk. This includes people affected by the chemical weapons linked to the Iran-Iraq war, in which the US backed Iraq. Sanctions-driven inflation and currency collapse forced many patients to turn to the black market, where drug prices were often several times higher than the official rates. Studies and reports indicate that some patients either delayed treatments, abandoned care entirely, or resorted to unsafe alternatives due to the cost and scarcity. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the effects of sanctions became even more visible. Iranian healthcare providers reported being overwhelmed with thousands of patients hospitalized while facing shortages of equipment and medicine. Financial restrictions limited the country's ability to procure necessary medical supplies, exacerbating the public health crisis during one of the most severe outbreaks globally. Iranian voices asking for help and sanctions relief to help address these issues were largely ignored. When it comes to US-Iranian relations, a pattern emerges, showing a constant lack of context in regards to Iran's responses to various episodes of border meddling. Iran has demonstrated a willingness to come to the table, negotiate, and follow through on agreements even when there is little trust and lack of guarantees.
Treating them as barbaric or unreasonable and not an equal partner with their own goals and ambitions is how you get into this mess in the first place. Whatever you might think of Iran, its government, its people, unnecessary hostility, sanctions, and other measures only end up hurting innocent civilians and making life more difficult will not result in any positive outcome.